I'm going to make the case to begin with that we're at a kind of peak AI hype. The way this gets played out in the media, but also in a lot of other forums as well, even in academic forums, in the government, is sort of two kinds of narratives here. One is a kind of narrative, and I label it up here, a kind of doom and gloom narrative. On the other hand, I think there are a whole lot of what I like to call rainbows and flowers narratives, right? Everything will be transformed by AI, and we're all going to be very, very happy. I call this, the singularity is maybe the most extreme version of this, where some people believe basically we invent AI and then AI invents everything for us. Right. So really what I'm going to talk about for the next 40 minutes or so is to push back on these narratives and suggest that there might be other things that we want to think about. Not only that, to put the case in the strongest form, that these narratives are wrong, but that they may be deeply problematic and misleading us in certain, well, what I think are very important ways. This is from a 2018 paper, but the survey was done in 2016. Basically surveys a whole lot of AI experts and says, when do you think AI is coming? So HLMI is human level machine intelligence, right? So that means, you know, AI is supposed to be as smart as us. Half of the people who were surveyed think that 50 years in the future, we'll have human level machine intelligence. But what I want to pay attention to here is maybe the more kind of microscopic details of a study like this, which look at, first of all, different kinds of jobs. I think also about this is just the range, the spread of opinions here is very revealing, right? These are experts in the field, right? And yet they seem to disagree. Maybe we don't have any idea, right? Or maybe we just don't know when, or maybe we shouldn't be too hopeful that this is actually going to happen. I want to stress here that many of the themes or narratives or ideas that we see about AI today are not new. They're not new at all. It was written in 1920, as I said, almost 100 years ago, first performed in 1921, right? So well before we had anything that looked like, you know, a digital computer. They're old narratives, not new ones. Why do I think that's important? Because I think that when we confront artificial intelligence and this question of whether we're going to get it, what kind of form is it going to take, I think it is very, very deeply about us. It's very, very deeply about what we are. So I think that solving AI problems forces us to interrogate very deeply questions about our own humanity. My first kind of quote up here is from the proposal for the famous Dartmouth conferences. They were hubristic enough to believe that all of the problems of AI would be solved by 10 men working together for a summer. A couple of years later, or the year after the Dartmouth conferences, Herbert Simon, another pioneer of AI, one of these founding fathers of AI, laid out a kind of program for what he thought would happen over the next 10 years. So hugely inflated hopes around these kinds of topics, right? Huge expectations, and probably many of you already know what happens next. This is the story, or the stories, I should say, of the so-called AI winters, right? And this is a story of overpromising, and it's a story of under-delivering, right? And really, it's a story partly about funding. The way investment works is, you know, people get excited, they invest lots of money, right? And it builds up and it builds up. But then, you know, ultimately, if you don't deliver, the money begins to go away. And again, consciously or unconsciously, one might think, you know, that this causes you to inflate rather than deflate the possibilities here. So I see this very much as driven by money in some sense. This would be my argument for why I think we're now in another hype cycle that may end, because I think actually we're more involved. The money is more present today. If you think just about all the companies that are deeply invested and investing more and more in AI, whether it's Google or Facebook or Alibaba or Tencent or, you know, thousands of smaller companies, right? The money, the financial investment is there, and there's no doubt that there's a kind of propagation, partly through a kind of economic incentive here. Also, I think that there are some interesting, what we might call warning signs, and I guess you could interpret these in different ways, but what I'm thinking of here is small failures of AI systems, which may, they may actually not be a big deal in the end, but they may be enough just to burst this bubble. Public trust. If public trust is not there, or corporate backing is not there, or government support is not there, that's also a failure. And it's going to have, essentially, what I see as very similar consequences. Won't it be different this time, right? They really want to cling on to this idea that actually this time it's going to be different. The argument, what's closer to what I want to say is something like, we're very bad at predicting the future, especially technological futures, and we should be very cautious. And especially, so I think here one of the examples that I like is actually about the internet. And you could say both the people who thought that it would be absolutely transformative were wrong, and the people who thought that it would be, nothing and that it would be inconsequential, well, they were obviously wrong, right? Because the people who thought it would be transformative thought that it would be transformative of scientific research. They did not think that it was going to be a tool for social, basically that was going to reboot our kind of social lives. It's going to go in a completely different direction, perhaps, that we haven't even thought of yet, right? That's often how technologies work out. So in the middle of the 1960s, there were a handful of people who did, in fact, make some right predictions about artificial intelligence. They predicted exactly that it would fail. Basically, that you can think of the brain or of the mind as information processing machines. That's what he takes to be the fundamental assumption of AI, and that's what he says is wrong. The world is not necessarily encodable into symbols that we can process like language, or that we can process in equations or something like that. Right. So he basically says these assumptions are wrong. Artificial intelligence will fail for these reasons. He turns out that this was pretty accurate, at least so far as it went, for the AI winters that we've had so far. John Searle came up with something called the Chinese room experiment. He just takes the message, he looks it up in his dictionary, he finds an appropriate response, he translates it back, he copies it back into Chinese, and he sticks it out the other end. So this is supposed to be a kind of provocative thought experiment to point out the difference between symbol processing or simulated intelligence that we might attribute to a robot and what we would like to say about ourselves, real intelligence. If we want to have artificial intelligence, what does this really mean? We have to have a concept of what is intelligence. But this is just a test about passing messages back and forth again. This is not just a critique of the Turing test, but I think it's also a critique of, it's a critique of the field in general in the sense that I'm not sure that we're going to know when we've got it. In theory, AI is trying to make something like the human mind, right? But what is the human mind? Well, for a long time, we've thought about it as, a computer. What if this assumption is wrong? What if the mind is not like a computer at all, right? And there are an increasing number of people in fields like neuroscience and cognitive sciences in general who are pushing back on this idea that the mind is a computer. And they think that this idea has fundamentally misled us. But it's also a big problem for AI, right? Because if the computational metaphor is wrong, then actually, again, it's going to be very hard to figure out what we're aiming at here. What are we trying to get? I think we just, as I've already said, may end up somewhere radically different from where we expect to be. We may not end up making just a copy of human intelligence or consciousness. And I like to illustrate this by the idea of thinking about embodiment. What does it mean to know how to ride a bicycle? You can only know how to do something like this if you have a body, and I think if you have a very particular kind of body. First of all, I think it challenges the idea that robots could just simply take over a lot of the tasks that humans could do, right? And it also, I think, challenges the idea that their knowledge or what even it means to have knowledge as a robot or as an artificial intelligence would be anything like our knowledge. It's embodied. There's an embodied quality to it. And that means it's going to be very difficult for AI to replicate it. But I think there are many, many problems that we have that just actually we don't worry about enough because we're distracted by the problem of what if robots take over the world, right? Or we're convinced by the hype that robots will solve all the problems. So one is this idea of surveillance capitalism. The idea basically that we live in a world in which data is more and more of a commodity that's being monopolized by both governments and corporations. Second, there are problems with algorithms. These are problems, a lot of them problems around transparency. This is a screenshot from a piece of software called Predpol, which uses data and algorithms about policing to decide where to deploy more police. The problem is that if you deploy more police to certain areas, they will inevitably detect crimes in those areas, right? Maybe petty crimes. So it creates these feedback loops, right, which can create very unfair systems in which certain neighborhoods, right, get basically over-policed and end up with a disproportionate number of people convicted in jail and so on. And then finally, I think we have, and this is related to these two problems with, I think, things like, I like to pick on Airbnb and Uber a lot, these kind of platform, what's been called platform economies or platform societies where, in fact, the concentration of data and the concentration and the use of algorithms by these systems, again, allows huge amounts of control to fall into the hands of not just people, but also the algorithms themselves. These are, in a sense, problems that are largely ignored because we think AI is just around the corner. And I think that perhaps this is, in a sense, leads me to the biggest reason why we may never get AI. And that's because we already got it. So I think there's a problem here of goalposts, shifting goalposts. As soon as AI can do something, then actually it's not AI. It's in fact it's something else, right? We reserve some capacity for ourselves. We're always something more than machines or less, but we're different to them. We're something special, and perhaps for that reason alone, AI will never arrive. It will always be just around the corner. All the more reason to focus on the problems we have right now. Thanks very much.